Top will begin. There we go. Good evening, everybody. I'm Mary Najimy, the president of the Massachusetts Teachers Association. We are bringing you our fifth, I believe, public health live stream forum. Tonight, I'm with my partner, Carlene Pavlos. Carlene, you want to say hello?
Hi, everyone. Carlene Pavlos here. It's really great to be here with MTA and with Mary.
It's great to have you as a sponsor. Tonight, we're really focusing on the breaking news of the week that educators are finally have a date certain to begin the vaccination program. We also have some critical new research that has been done by one of our colleagues at the Harvard P.F. Chan School of Public Health. We'll talk about on the cusp of the April 1st start date of full in-person. We're also having Mass Kosh with us again, talking about the things that we absolutely know we can and must do to keep safe. And tonight we have stories from educators from the Worcester Public Schools so that we really get a sense of who are the people that are impacted, who are the people behind the numbers that we so often hear. And Carlene, that's where I started tonight. Tonight, I'm actually broadcasting from our MTA office in Worcester because I just left the EAW, the Education Association of Worcester rally. It was a rally of all of the education support professionals who were having three demands. One, vaccinate. Their motto tonight was vaccination, negotiation, so we can have safe education. And that's where I really want to start. We had a very important victory this week with getting a start date for school employees to be vaccinated. And that will provide an added layer of safety to the nearly 80% of Massachusetts school employees who are already on the front lines in some in-person learning model. Mm-hmm. And the reason why we won that was because the calls started in the union halls, that we must vaccinate our school employees and our higher ed faculty and staff because they've already started. The call was taken up by our members. They wrote letters, they made phone calls, they did social media posting, and the superintendents, the school committees added to the call. Our state legislators started writing letters, adding to the call. House Speaker Ron Mariano stepped up and showed real leadership, as well as Senate President Spilka. And finally, the leader of the free world a couple of days ago said educators must be vaccinated and vaccinated now. So we are... it is definitely going to make more safe reopening plans, which are already underway in almost every single district across the state. But there's still no concrete for an equitable, effective, and efficient program to get it done. All of this is coming on the heels of the Department of Education directing schools to reopen by the first week of April. And tonight we have new information that school infection rates are higher than what the Department of Education has been reporting. This is all the more reason why we must get school employees vaccinated and why the decision to move to full in-person has to remain at the local level. There's no question we are all wanting to be back full in-person, but the union advocacy is one where we are advocating to keep our educators and our entire school community safe. The Department of Education purports that opening schools is an issue of equity, but the state is not truly looking through a lens of equity, as the decision that the board is going to take tomorrow is heavily weighted from the voices of white suburban parents over the voices of communities of color who are saying they're not ready to return. So Carlene, I'm going to ask you to take a couple of moments and shine some light on how the social determinants of health have only deepened the inequity in schools and in communities of color, and then we'll get started with our panelists.
Thanks so much, Mary. I really am only going to take a couple of minutes because I am as eager as everyone else is to hear from the speakers that are coming up. So I really am going to take just a couple of minutes and say that while we listen to these speakers, I really hope that we can think about a couple of things. As Mary said, we had a significant victory this week, and it's because collective voices raised together work, right? And we have to keep up the pressure because we aren't yet where we need to be in the state's response for equity in the vaccine rollout. We're not even close. And one of the things I really ask that you think about is that eligibility for vaccination is not the same as access to vaccination. And that is just, we are seeing that time and time again as the state rolls out what is really a very flawed plan where people in communities that have been hardest hit by COVID have the least access to the vaccine through the mechanisms that the state has set out, right? We have mass vaccination sites, an online portal, all of which privilege. An expression that I really love is we have created lines for those who know how to get at the head of lines, right? They really privilege people who have access to good internet, who have the ability to sit online and wait for appointments to roll out, who have access to a car, who can afford to take time off, that aren't, working hourly and can afford to take time off to get to an appointment and just sit online to make an appointment. So eligibility does not equal access. And I think that you're going to continue to hear stories in the press about how little real access there is for poor people and people of color. And I also want to emphasize something that Mary has just highlighted for us, which is that the calls to reopen schools are not coming from all sectors. There is some more recent research from the Pew Research Center that really shows that that people of color, Black and Latinx people, are much more concerned about reopening schools. And that's because it is people of color who have seen the impacts of COVID, of high rates of COVID in their communities that are most concerned about sending their kids to school. And so there's this real disparity in the calls for return to school that we're seeing in white suburban communities versus communities of color. And it's really important for us to take that seriously because we should be thinking about policy that is aligned with the voices of those who have been most impacted in this pandemic, rather than those who come with privilege and power. So I hope that as we're listening to some of this tonight, we can listen with ears that are thinking with a critical lens about the equity that we're demanding and ways to get there. And I'm going to stop there so that we can move really quickly to our speakers.
Right. So I'd like to welcome back Alan Geller. He's a senior lecturer in the Department of Social and Behavioral Sciences at Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. Alan has been with us in the past, and he regularly updates us on how things are changing with children, both in schools and in the community. So welcome, Alan. Tell us what you've discovered lately.
Thank you very much, Mary and Carlene. It's great to be with everybody. And this has just been an historic and most challenging time for teachers and families in Massachusetts, probably unparalleled. And teachers and families have faced two monumental issues over just the last week. As the point was made, we could have the first slide if you'd be fine. Thank you. So where we've seen schools required to be opening up on April 5th, while at the same time Governor Baker has essentially reopened a large part of the community, with more plans to do so by March 22nd. So bottom line, all experts should agree. One should not open schools and dance halls at the same time. Governor Baker has made a fundamental error, which he's made many times before, and that's a misunderstanding of the data. If it gets too hot in the community, that is, if there's too many cases in the community, it's going to spill into the schools. If there's too many cases in the schools, it's going to spill into the community. This, I think, is an essential part of the distrust that parents and teachers have of the governor and policymakers, and it spills over. If he's told us time and time again that the rates will go down, or that if I open up, everything will be fine, and it's not, it sows this kind of mistrust. And if you look at survey data, the same folks in Massachusetts who have concerns about the vaccine are the same parents who have concerns about sending kids back to school. They all bleed, they all run together. And if we think about the question of how do we build a sense of community and a sense of trust, it has to come from our policy leaders. It has to come from on top. And at this point, it's not. So I can go on to the next slide. So as it's been mentioned, of course, the full-scale vaccination will be starting hopefully in mid-March of educators. The hope would be is that we can surely aim for most Massachusetts educators to have received their first dose at least by April 15th. Mary talked about the fact that that state legislators, President Biden, it's wonderful having a first lady who is an educator, the great advocacy work led by teachers and families to push for this really helped to make it work. And at the same time, a couple of days before, going back to the precipitous reopening of our communities, we have a great new CDC director, along with a great new president and a great first lady. And she said very clearly, Dr. Walensky, please hear me clearly. At this level of cases, with variants spreading, we stand to completely lose the hard-earned ground we have gained. Next slide, please. And she warned of a potential fourth surge of the virus. So right now, in many states, the numbers have stalled at about 70,000 cases per day and 2,000 deaths per day across the country. That's far too many, and it's back to where things were in the early part of the summer. And she goes on to say, now is not the time to relax the critical safeguards that we know could stop the spread of COVID-19 in our communities, not when we are so close. And really, next slide, please. So we talked about the first phase that Governor Baker has done, returning to phase 3, step 2 of the state's reopening plan, easing restrictions for restaurant capacity and allowing indoor venues to reopen with restrictions. This is just the beginning. In a little bit more than 2 weeks, on March 22nd, unless some changes are made, unless we can see that prioritizing getting kids back to school safely is what we're all about, the state is slated to move to phase 4. Phase 4 is a big deal. It includes the opening up of amusement parks, theme parks, saunas, bars, convention halls. So the same places that are open up in the community, again, are going to bleed into schools, with schools opening just 2 weeks later. And we've made progress. I came and I spoke with you a month ago, and I reported to you that there were 9 towns and cities with an average daily incidence rate greater than 100 per 100,000. That means if you live in a city of 100,000 people, every day there would have been 100 new cases of COVID. We haven't seen that now for a while. Today, I'm happy to report that there are no towns and cities in Massachusetts whose rates are higher than 50 per 100,000. And the rates began to drop between January 9th and January 24th. And if it weren't for the variants looming, we'd probably be making really profound progress that would be persistent. Next slide, please. And we know this, we can see this, and we have a strong hunch that this is a natural downturn from the Thanksgiving and Christmas surges. That Christmas surge, post-Christmas surge probably hit its peak around January 9th or January 10th. We know that we're seeing some positive effects from vaccination, because we know for any of you who have family members living in congregate living situations, you know that your parents and your grandparents have been vaccinated lately, and this is all really important and is probably stemming the tide of the virus there. Again, this data that we're seeing, this positive data, does not reflect the potential impact of the variants at this point. Next slide, please. So is it time to celebrate? I think you can hear what I'm saying, and we would probably all agree. Not yet. One must take great pause before fully reopening the state, where the rates were high to very high just 4 weeks ago. So we decided to try and look at some myths and facts. We tried to look at 3 what now seems to be myths that the governor and other policymakers have been putting forward. And we have the great benefit of being able to use a fantastic database, which is right at our fingertips. That's the Massachusetts School Dashboard. So I presented here 4 weeks ago. I made a plea for people to send me the dashboards. And what do you know? A parent and a number of teachers sent me their dashboards, and I had the chance to review as many of them as possible. And I'll share this with you in the next slide. So I wanted to look at the first myth. That first myth is we have long known that children are far less susceptible to COVID-19 than adults. This came from the Boston Globe in support of Governor Baker's reopening of schools proclamation. You can see this in the editorial on February 26, 2021. So next slide. What we tried to do is to look to see how true that was. And I did not know the answer to it until we had a chance to look at it. And so the next slide, what I can start talking about it, we'll see that what we did is we reviewed dashboards from 18 districts across the state where there was a specific report of how many children in the schools were diagnosed with COVID. So these 18 districts made up 67,000 children. Of the 67,000 children who were in school, more than 3,000 were diagnosed with COVID, and the 556,000 residents in those same communities. And the data was striking. Remember the myth. The myth is that school children are far less likely to get COVID than their counterparts, older counterparts in the community. And you can see here that is not the case. The fact is 5% of school children and 5% of residents of the same community have been diagnosed with COVID since school began in September. So this is from September 15th, 2020 to February 27th, 2021. So remember, that is the first fact. It's exactly the same. Myth number 2, there's a lower incidence of COVID-19 among younger children compared to older children. So we looked at that, and there is a very slight difference. We can see that in the next slide. There are a few differences in rates. So what we did is there's 39 school districts made up of hundreds of thousands of children where we looked, where the district leaders and the district nurses showed us whether or not the cases were in the elementary schools, the middle schools, or the high schools. And as you can see here, few differences in rates between elementary school students, that's 4%, middle school students, that's 5%, and high school students, that's 6%. I want to be careful. This is not transmission. Most of the dashboards do go on to say that there's been very little in-school transmission. But again, whether this is coming from within the school or it's coming from hockey or through parents, we know that in the schools, 1 out of every 20 children have been diagnosed with COVID. And as one of your colleagues pointed out, that's the equivalent to 1 child in every classroom in Massachusetts. And the third myth, the policymakers, the governor will tell us that the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education reports few cases of COVID. He's not going to be looking at all of the dashboards, but when you look at all of the dashboards and you total them up, they reveal something very different than what DESE is reporting. And I can share that with you in the next slide. The data source that DESE has been using to show low rates in schools dramatically understates the true numbers as reported on the dashboards. In a review of more than 80 Massachusetts district dashboards, there are more than 3 times as many cases than reported by DESE in the same towns and cities. So again, looking what the school dashboards say, look what DESE says, and the numbers are 3 times greater on the dashboards. DESE will say we don't show cases that have been diagnosed in the last 7 days, but at least we should be able to see what that data looks like and the data that we're reporting here tonight to give you a true sense of the toll of COVID, both in staff and in students in our state. So with CDC guidelines, very briefly, just to go through this, because I think we should review this. Full in-person learning is recommended in areas where the CDC reports that 50 new cases per 100,000 people in a week and a 7-day positivity rating of less than 8%. We're not there yet. We've made improvements, but even still, we can go on to the next slide. Even in areas where there's growing rates or high rates, we can see well, essentially what that next slide will say, sorry. So schools in these areas are still supposed to take precautions, including wearing masks, washing hands, cleaning facilities, and keeping everyone at least 6 feet apart to the greatest extent possible. So it's important that we don't lose the battle, that we don't forget about the importance of social distancing. And again, we have strong support from the CDC that puts forward this notion that we should be attempting at least 6-foot borders or boundaries to the greatest extent possible. On to the next slide. Hybrid learning. Now, this is what's recommending. It's important to see that the commissioner calling for all schools to reopen is counter to what our government, to what the CDC is saying. The CDC is saying that there should be hybrid learning with some students in school and others learning online at home is the recommendation when a community has 50 to 100 new weekly cases. So again, they're giving the numbers and they're coming forward with the point of, according to the recommendations, which say the 6-foot separation is required. So the bottom line point there is we see differences between what the commissioner and the governor are saying compared with what the CDC is saying on these very fundamental issues. Next slide, please. I don't need to, people have access to this. Again, the point of it being that physical distancing, at least 6 feet, should be maximized to the greatest extent possible. The point is that the commissioner and the governor want to reopen schools, and then they're trying to use a rationalization that we can do so with 3 feet of distance between the teacher and the child and 3 feet between kids, when in fact, the federal government is still, CDC is still talking about the importance of 6 feet whenever possible and to the greatest extent possible. Next slide, please. So the last part is the question of the day, the notion of equitable access to vaccines for Massachusetts educators. This is a slide from CDC. The states that you see in yellow, I think it totals 32 or 34, are the states that up until a week ago are now vaccinating their educators. So Massachusetts, we can add to that group. We can hope that other states will continue to do it. We know that there's been very high participation rate when teachers have been asked to be vaccinated. And we are absolutely sure through the surveys that have been done of Massachusetts teachers, that there will be very high receptivity to it in Massachusetts as well. And finally, the way forward, the CDC encourages states to prioritize teachers for vaccination, but will not set it as a precondition or prerequisite for opening. That was from a few days ago, and as we all know, things changed when President Biden said last night, my goal is to get a shot in the arm of every teacher in the United States by the end of March. So that's our charge. And again, because of advocacy by teachers and a push from the president, the goal is to do that, to get a teacher in every arm. This may take a little longer in Massachusetts because of a little later start. We have promise now. We don't know what vaccine will be available to teachers, but we can see here, and it's important to point out that the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, not one of 20,000 participants who received this vaccine in the phase 3 trials had to be hospitalized, which is an incredibly important metric. And we know, secondly, for the Pfizer vaccine after the first dose, and of course, we're hoping that everybody on this call gets 2 doses and gets them quickly, but I just wanted to point out that the efficacy is between 80% and 86% for the Pfizer vaccine after just the first dose. So finally, in conclusion, we have tremendous promise going forward, and we can really begin to ask the question, what are the rates of COVID-19 in the school-age population in the 30 states where teacher vaccinations are more robust? This is a very important question that we can look at, we can hypothesize, that will begin to, and we've started to see a drop in pediatric COVID. We've seen that we have high rates to begin with of 5% or 1 in 20 children, and we believe that vaccinations will help not only teachers' families, but the children that they teach as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Alan. And Carlene, before you introduce our next guest, Julia, I do want to emphasize a couple of things that are coming up in the chat. And that are related to what Alan said. Having educators vaccinated, the position of the MTA has always been in line with the CDC guidelines that it isn't a prerequisite, but it gives what the CDC is saying an added layer of protection. And given that we have had so many educators in the building and 3,000 higher ed faculty and staff, they deserve that. They are taking care of the children of Massachusetts, and the state needs to take care of them. This is another reason, Heather La Roberts asks, or Rachel Lee asks, somebody asked in the chat, made a comment about educators needing accommodations if they're not able to teach in person. It's those kinds of things. It's figuring out, can we keep 6 feet? Is it in making sure that our ventilation systems are really working? All of the reasons why the commissioner should allow schools to continue to follow the timeline that they are on, because they are doing their due diligence, using the resources that they have, and knowing the conditions in their communities. The state can't possibly know the granular detail in 1,800 buildings that gives him the authority to say, on a date certain, we are going fully remote. And while he will leave waivers, there's also no certainty that every single district who needs a waiver will get the waiver. So I think these are things to consider. And Carlene, tell us who's coming next, because this is more information to add to the mix.
That's right, Mary. We are really very lucky to be joined by Dr. Julia Kohler. Julia is a pediatrician and an infectious disease specialist. She's also the assistant professor of pediatrics at Harvard Medical School. And she's going to talk a little bit more about some of what we know about the variants, about where the pandemic is right now. And we'll also have a chance to ask her some questions through the chat. So keep the questions coming. Julia, thanks so much for being with us.
You're on mute, Julia. Still having a hard time hearing you. And while Julia's fixing her sound, Steph Buck, I do want to fully agree with you 100%.
Do you hear me?
We can hear you now, yeah, Julia. I was just saying to Steph Buck that absolutely school employees deserve the vaccine, and our students deserve in-person learning for sure. There's no doubt. We have to have all hands on deck to make that happen. And it has to happen in a way that protects them, their families, the entire school community. And that's why the school districts know when it's time for that to happen. Julia.
Yeah, thank you so much. Very important issues that Alan has highlighted, and the reason why the level of transmission is so important for us to think about is because now we're dealing with new variants that have emerged in other countries and in this country. This slide is to show you that every time the virus infects a new person, that new person is a lottery ticket, because in this person, it can select for those of its mutants that give it an advantage in terms of being able to replicate more quickly, to infect us more efficiently, and to spread to higher numbers. So what I'm saying is any human being that becomes infected gives the virus a chance to use its trial and error systems of mutation and selection to become better at infecting us, to become potentially more deadly, and also to evade our immune defenses. Next slide, please. So I just want to show you some of the variants that have emerged, because the reason they are important, because all the information we now have on how we can successfully block, for example, the 6 feet, that is with the old variants, the traditional, I'm saying, the genotype of the virus that spread from China to Europe and to this country. So let's have the next slide. So what you see is in the middle is the ribosome, the ribonucleic acid of the virus, encased in its protein shell, and with the spike protein that we're going to be looking at for these variants sticking out. And then the cartoon shows the protein transcript from that RNA molecule. And on the right is the red cartoon for that spike protein. Let's go to the next slide. I just want to talk about some of these variants. This variant, B117, arose in England last fall. It rapidly spread throughout southeastern England. It caused a surge, a devastating surge in England in January, spread to Europe, and is present in 44 states of this country now. And it has a mutation in this 501 amino acid residue that allows it to bind more tightly, because that spike protein is the key that binds to an enzyme on our cells as in a lock and allows the virus to enter our cell. So if that key can bind more tightly, the virus just floats by and already binds. And so this virus grows up to higher levels in a person. It infects more efficiently. And in England, it was seen to be about 30% more deadly. However, it is not known to be able to escape our immunity. Next slide, please. So what you're seeing on the right is looking at the spike protein from the top at this clover leaf of three of these proteins that have that form the functional spike. And This model shows the mutant that arose in South Africa, the variant B1351. They all have some other mutations, but this one has one in amino acid 484 that allows it to escape immunity that people who went through the disease or people who got some vaccines have acquired. And that is because now the shape of this key has changed such that the antibodies coming at it from that we have formed and potentially also our T lymphocytes no longer recognize it well, no longer block well this locking of this key into our enzyme lock. And so this variant with that E484K mutation can now potentially infect some people who have been vaccinated. And there's a lot we still don't know about that, but that is the potential of some of these variants. And let's go to the next slide. This South African B1351 mutant has also appeared in Massachusetts, as in some other states. All these mutants are also more infectious and virulent. That's why they're able to spread more. And then the next slide, please. So there's another variant that arose in Brazil, in the Amazon, where the virus was finding huge numbers of humans in which to practice and select its most advantageous variants because protective measures were not available to the poor population of that region. And so this variant called P1 has the mutations that let it proliferate more rapidly and become more infectious. It has the immune escape mutation E484K, and most concerningly and disturbingly, it led to another surge in Manaus in January that was catastrophic because the hospitals ran out of oxygen after an estimated 76% of the people of Manaus had already gone through an infection in their first wave, raising a grave concern that this variant can quite efficiently escape immunity. Next slide, please. The point that I'm trying to make with all of this is that the more we fail to provide barriers to the virus, to stop it from getting from one person to the next, so the more of its test tubes, its lottery tickets that it gets from us because we're not distancing sufficiently, we're not providing the ventilation that gets rid of those viral aerosols, etc., the more likely we are to breed new variants, and the more dangerous it becomes that we get variants that can escape the immunity now conferred by our very effective vaccines. The reason this is so important is because the teachers have really been the only workers, I will say, or people serving the community that have had through their unions the ability to insist on measures that break this transmission, the seeking of the virus of a new lottery ticket that every infection represents. And so I would applaud you for doing that. I am convinced we need the ventilation, we need the distancing, we need the masks to stop this transmission, to drive the numbers down such that we get in front of the pandemic with our vaccines and not behind the variants as they become able to escape our immunity. So it is a race with time right now. That's what Dr. Walensky and Dr. Fauci are saying. We are racing against the virus that is seeking us out to optimize itself, to infect us, and to escape the immunity that we mount against it. And so that is really what. Okay, lastly, just a quick last point. If we allow the virus to proliferate unchecked, of course, it's also going to produce new variants here in this country, and that's what it has been doing. The reason they're less well known and less well understood is because our surveillance of these variants has been 42nd in the world compared with other countries, whereas, for example, the United Kingdom is very good at that. So long story short, we have variants that are spreading in this country. We need to stop their transmission. The CDC is now working to surveil them, and unless we can't act as if we knew what to expect, and as if everything was hunky-dory. Even if these numbers that Alan showed us were not so concerning, we have to be humble about the fact that there is a lot going on now in the biology of the virus that we don't know. So we have to use the precautionary principle so we don't fall behind again. Thank you.
Thanks, Julia. And I can see Rachel Leah must have been doing her union homework and participating in our union classes on environmental health and safety, because she really is making some important points about always what you are reminding us. Ventilation is key. Ventilation controls infection in the building. And our next guest will talk about that in a moment. I just also want to point out, you might see answers in the chat from Mike Fadel, from Dean Robinson, from Scott Fulmer. Those are our MTA team. So if you are getting those answers, those are the official answers that are coming from the MTA if we're not able to answer your questions on the screen. So Carlene, let's bring on our next guest.
I just have to say, I second Melissa Faulkner. What amazing information. It is so important to get this kind of scientific understanding, right, of the virus, and to also hear some of these important facts from Alan Geller. And now here comes more incredibly important information. There is a lot in the chat about what school environments we need to have to help keep us safe, because vaccination eligibility for vaccination alone is certainly not where we are right now in a comprehensive picture of what's going to keep us safe. And we are incredibly lucky to have with us Jody Sugarman-Brozan. Jody is the executive director of the Massachusetts Coalition for Occupational Safety and Health, and she's also a public school parent. And she really, really, really knows her stuff. So we are thrilled to have you here. Thanks so much, Jody.
Thanks so much for having me, and thank you to Dr. Geller and to Dr. Kohler for once again pointing out such important information. And the data on cases in public schools is really, really important. I wanted to start by just framing this issue to remind people what we've learned over the last year, and that is that this virus, this disease, is an occupational disease. Hundreds, if not thousands, of workers in Massachusetts have become sick as a result of workplace exposure to COVID and even died. And we may never know the true impact because the state has failed to collect the data on occupation for those who tested positive for COVID. But we do know some things. And there was a study that just came out a couple of weeks ago that looked at the death certificates of people who had died of COVID-19, and it looked at their occupation. And it found very clearly that people in occupations who had to work outside the home were dying at higher rates than people who were able to work in occupations that did not put them out on the front lines. And that was really important. And the study also found something else that was really, really important, and that is that workers of color were 4 times more likely to die in those same occupations. And even in the same occupation, they found this. If you were a Latinx food service worker, you were 8 times more likely to die than your white counterparts in that same occupation. So I just want to make sure that we talk about this virus as it is, which is an occupational disease. And the state is not doing a very good job at keeping workers safe from this. We know that the Department of Labor Standards has investigated almost 1,500 complaints from workers, about half of which have uncovered violations of the state's COVID-19 workplace safety regulations, which, by the way, K through 12 schools are exempt from. Department of Labor Standards has also been brought in to look at just short of 500 workplace clusters of COVID-19. And it's really important to think about that educators and folks working in school buildings are not immune to this workplace. They can that are over longer periods of times than a lot of other workers. Yet they don't have the same protections as the COVID-19 workplace safety regulations. And it is taking its toll. Just this week, just tonight, the new data on the state's website, the public health data that they put out on COVID every week, reported that there are 338 active clusters in childcare settings and 50 in K through 12 schools. So we hear a lot about how there's no transmission in schools, yet there are 50 active clusters this week alone in K through 12 schools in Massachusetts. And the combined number of cases in those 338 clusters in childcare and 50 in K through 12 schools is 473 active clusters. So it's not a small amount. So I think I just wanted to give that context. So as we hear from Commissioner Riley that he wants to gain the power tomorrow to be able to push forward with reopening schools by April 1, it leaves me and I think my colleagues at MassCosh very concerned, because DESE is in charge of ensuring the health and safety of people in schools. We know that they are not getting the same protection that other workers are from the regulations, and DESE's guidelines are not protective. We already know from Dr. Geller that they're moving forward with reopening, even though the CDC has said that the weekly incident rates are not low enough in Massachusetts to sustain full reopening in almost every county in Massachusetts. A New York Times study looked at this and found that only Franklin County is low enough to meet the CDC criteria for full reopening. The other thing that the that the DESE maintains is that 3-foot distancing is all you need to keep people safe. And there was a question about this in the chat, and I just want to address this because the CDC says very clearly that 6-foot distancing, and this is in their new guidelines just released at the end of February, 6-foot distancing and keeping a minimum of 6 feet distance between people is what is most safe. And in fact, in places where we have higher levels of incident, that it is actually absolutely required. And it's important to also point out that the state's COVID-19 workplace safety regulations require employers to ensure that workers have at least 6-foot distance from other workers, customers, etc. So the state has already set this standard. So it is unclear to me why DESE maintains that 3-foot distancing is safe enough. Really, we want 6-foot distancing, but I think it's also really important to point out that DESE is also failing, and this is something that has come up a few times, that at the beginning of the pandemic, we really were focused on larger droplets, and that meant contaminated surfaces and fabric face coverings were needed to keep people safe. Now, scientific evidence is incontrovertible that breathing tiny particles called aerosols is what is a main way that the virus is being spread. And in order to keep people safe from that, it is not just 6-foot distancing we need, but also high quality masks and 95 respirators, which are now much more available than they were at the beginning of the pandemic. And we also need high quality ventilation and filtration. And we need to see enough fresh air coming into school buildings to dilute the air and make sure that the virus is being filtered out. And that ideally, you want 4 or 5 air changes per hour. Bessie really doesn't even talk about ventilation in their guidelines, and we know that this is something that is really a problem because many of the school buildings, especially in many of the districts that are struggling to reopen in lower income communities and larger urban districts, are in buildings where the air quality was poor before COVID. We already had poor indoor air quality, and now we're dealing with these same buildings and trying to ensure that we have enough ventilation, and that requires investment and upgrades that just aren't happening. Um, so I do want to say that vaccination and the victory this week is huge. As a parent, I'm so happy to see this. As a sister of an educator, I'm so happy to see this. But I do want to just make sure that folks understand that vaccination is one part of a larger comprehensive infectious disease control program. This does not get school districts, employers off the hook for ensuring 6-foot distancing, high quality PPE and masks, ensuring pool testing, testing in order to identify asymptomatic cases, tracing, cleaning and disinfection. These are all so critical and need to continue even after teachers and educators and school staff are vaccinated. And I just want to make sure people really know that, because I already hear employers and even school committees saying we want to vaccinate teachers so we don't have to worry about health and safety in the buildings anymore. And that's just not the case. So I do just want to reiterate that we will be submitting to Bessie tomorrow a letter encouraging that they do not approve the proposal put forward by Commissioner Riley, because we believe that the people who understand best the challenges in every district, in every building, are the people who live, work, and teach in those buildings. And that control of when and how schools should open should be at that level. There is no one size fits all in Massachusetts. And many, many districts may have the resources to provide pool testing. They may have the resources to do those upgrades, but that is not true across the entire Commonwealth. And in fact, those communities that have been most hard hit by COVID are most often the communities that don't have the resources to invest in their school buildings to make them safe. That's it. I can answer some questions, or thanks so much for having me here tonight. It's really great to be able to share with this great set of panelists.
Thank you, Jody. I'm starting to echo, I think, a little. Right. Great, thank you. So I want to point out something that Steph Buck is asking in the chat. Should all first responders be doing pool testing?
Absolutely. I think pool testing is a really critical way to identify asymptomatic cases. We know much of the spread of COVID-19 is through asymptomatic cases, and pool testing is a really important tool in the toolbox to identify those and prevent spread.
And I have to say, we worked really hard to win a pool testing program for all of the public schools in Massachusetts. Here's where DESE needs to put more effort. If they are insisting that we go back to school, it took them 9 months. 9 months of us insisting from, through the unions that pool testing become a measure. It finally is. And it's still not being as used to its full capacity because districts are worried. The state is paying for 6 weeks and districts are worried that the federal funds that are supposed to cover it are still not going to be enough. So the commissioner and the governor need to continue to put resources, significant resources, into the communities where we want to have our children back full in person, but just don't have the safety measures in place for their sake, for the sake of their families, and for the sake of the frontline workers who are the educators. So I want to, Jody, thank you so much. I want to bring on some frontline workers now who often are invisible. Too often you hear the governor and the news use the word teachers, because that's who we see first and foremost in the schools. But schools have many employees. We call them education support professionals, and we call them educators. We go beyond the word teacher and we use the word educator because it's much more inclusive. We have bus drivers, cafeteria workers, secretarial staff, custodial staff, groundskeepers, maintenance, and they are often invisible to the general public. They are highly visible to their students. Their students love them. They play a critical role in the wellness and the education of the children of Massachusetts. So it's a great pleasure for me to introduce now two of our education support professionals from the Worcester Education Association. Ashley Alphaberg is a paraeducator in Worcester Public Schools, working as a one-on-one in the life skill programs in one of the high schools. She's been in Worcester for 15 years. And Tina Mansfield is a bus driver in Worcester. She's an aide to the physically handicapped students, and she's been in Worcester for 15 years. I want them to tell their stories because too often they're just numbers. So let's start with Tina. Tina, tell us what the conditions are like and what the union fight forward is to make sure that you, your coworkers, and your students and their families are protected.
Good evening, and I'd like to thank everybody for all the information that they've given also. So I'm an aide to the physically handicapped, which is a bus driver. I drive a small bus or a mid-sized bus. My bus has 16 students on it, plus a monitor. So my monitor has to assist our disabled and our disobedient students on and off the bus. My monitor also has to seatbelt these students in to make sure that they're safe. These are there are kids the minute they leave your home. They're part of us. They're our family once they enter our bus. And of course, we're the first and the last educators that they see during the day. So with this DESE guidelines, that really upsets us. The DESE says 3 feet is far enough. My students aren't going to be 3 feet apart. They're going to be 2 students to a seat. That is only like a 3-foot seat. My students are supposed to sit in an assigned seat. What student do you know that wants to sit in an assigned seat except in a classroom? They want to be with their friends. They want to be with their girlfriend. They want to talk. They want to, socialize. They haven't seen each other in almost a year. The windows have to be open. We have rain. We have snow. These kids are going to be cold. They're going to want to shut the windows. It can't be done. They're not to eat on our bus. Any child that comes on with a lunch for school usually have their snacks eaten before they even get into school. But they're not going to be able to do that. No shouting, no singing. So you're going to tell the student that they can't talk to the person in the front of the bus. They're going to want to take off that mask so their friends can hear. These are our students. They want to be near us. They want to touch us, hug us. Also, they're disabled. A lot of our students aren't going to wear masks. So how do you keep them 6 feet from everybody else? The city is not doing their job. Our superintendent, Maureen, is not doing her job. She says, just talk to the kids. They'll put a mask on. I don't think she's been on my bus. Our kids spit. They bite. They hit. my monitor will get attacked for no good reason. But there are students, there are our children. Our fears are, these are too close quarters. My bus is 10 feet. 18 people on this bus. It's not safe. On our big buses, they hold 48 students. They're going to put 48 students on a bus. The windows have got to be opened. But that bus driver doesn't have a monitor to make sure that everybody has their mask on, that they're not jumping around, they're not fighting. It's not safe for them either. So our fears is that we're going to contract the COVID, bring it home, or even if we have it, we're going to give it to our students. It's not fair. We want to be vaccinated. We've been promised to be vaccinated, and it hasn't happened yet. So I want to end, please listen to your educators. Vaccinate so that we may educate our students safely and in person. Thank you.
Thanks, Tina. Ashley, I'd love to turn it over to you next.
Hi, I want to thank Mary for inviting us here. It's very rare that I get to speak on what I love. I've been in our system for 15 years now, and I've been working with our behavioral autistic students for the past 8 years or so. And I haven't seen my student in over a year, and it's been difficult. She hasn't really been doing the virtual online either, which is that's okay. But the fact that I haven't seen her in that long is difficult. Some of the virtual learning has been a good thing for some of our kids, just across the board. Some definitely need to be in person as well, but it's a hard job. One thing we always say as parents in the especially in the life skill room is safety first and flexibility, and that definitely applies to what we're doing now, right? How we're trying to adjust to everything. Some of with the reopening, we're going back to school next week, so there's a lot of concerns across the board with everyone. Just in dealing with life skill students, it's a rewarding job, but one of the most challenging jobs. And I love it, but the reality is not every life skill classroom is the same. Some classrooms are not even classrooms. Some are old teachers' cafeterias that they made into a classroom. Some is the basement, and some don't have windows, and there's not really good ventilation. So that's the thing. And every classroom is different. So what works for one school doesn't always work for every school, right? So these are all things that should be taken into consideration when it comes to the behaviors. It's pulling hair, the biting, the spitting, the kicks, and on all those things. And that's before the PPE stuff. So it's changing the students. We get parents who change kids all day long, and that's not even with the scheduled bathroom times. That's with the surprises that come with working with the kids that we do, So how much PPE does that take? And that's just in like a one day, never mind the rest of the year, and that goes against kind of the 3 foot rule, the 6 foot rule. Our kids don't know what 6 feet is. So that's a lot of, okay, buddy, you gotta stay back. We gotta keep telling, you gotta stay back. Our kids are very loving. They love the huggers. They love the high fives, the fist bumps, and we haven't seen them. So they definitely want to hug us. And I miss those hugs, so how do you tell them like, oh no, we can't, it's a hard thing that we're trying to adjust to, all of us. So with everything else, like my question is, some of our kids, their behaviors can be extreme to the point where we have to evacuate our classrooms. Okay, so if we're teaching kids online as well, and there's never enough parents to work in large scale classrooms. There's just never enough bodies. So if we have to handle that situation with the teacher trying to control that behavior of a kid throwing stuff all over the place, how do we evacuate the other kids? And then what about the Chromebooks and all the kids that are running online? Everything stops, right? So that takes a long time to get in control. Never mind if they're bolted for the room, running outside, the whole nine. Sometimes there's just never enough bodies in a rescue room. But we do the best that we can do. That's where the wants to be flexible comes in. But sometimes it just isn't enough. So it's very difficult but rewarding. And then with the cleansing and the if they're throwing stuff and everything else, we clean our tables and our stuff all day long anyway. This is that's just it's just part of our job. So with the constant, even going to the bathroom changes, everything is not a group anymore. So that kind of takes away from the running as well, just because we gotta bring the kids there and then bringing back. And how do we do it all? And then at the same time, we gotta make sure the kids who are running at home still are still getting that time as well. You know, it's definitely it's going to be a challenge. I think that safety is first. You know, the vaccine is important. If that's what you think that you should do, not everyone feels safe with that, and you have that right as well. So even with that, I think I would feel better if we went back in August. You know, that's just my personal opinion. But even with everything, you still gotta be aware of the importance of safety. There's always, I don't know if, you know, there should be measures that should be taken when it comes to the behavior of things that affect the brain. So when that happens, how do we have enough, how do we prevent it from happening to have a correct game plan? Sometimes we wait for things to happen instead of taking control before, you know what I mean, to make everything work and flow well. So, but everything comes down to safety first. And at some point we will be going back to the buildings, you know, full time, like 100%. So when that does happen, I can't wait, honestly. But I think it's all just going to be a learning process. And we're going to keep rolling with the punches just like we do. That's what we do. So.
And Ashley, the challenge that you're describing, or to us, to the state about safety, I think is really encapsulated by what Melissa Faulkner is saying. This is a complicated decision for all of us, right? Families have risks, and Melissa really outlines what her anxiety is and her health factors. And it really just speaks to the fact that when unions start to organize and advocate and make buildings safe, we are making buildings safe for everybody. So anyone who walks into a building that does not have, a school building that does not have proper ventilation, it's going to exacerbate their asthma or their respiratory disease. In the time of COVID, it's not going to clean the air well. And schools aren't in bubbles, are they? There's hundreds of students and educators and families and community members that walk in and out every day. So I would love for each of you, just take maybe one more minute each. You're unionists, and you know that your work as unionists is to ensure that school is safe for everybody. Tell us quickly how, as unionists, you're organizing to win safe conditions for your communities.
Well, tonight we had a rally out in front of City Hall while school committee was going on. We had a lot of people turn out, a lot of educators. And our community was a big support, going around City Hall, blowing their horns, and other locals coming and representing or supporting us as we are supporting the Worcester St. Vincent nurses that are going through the same thing, but, you know, too many patients. But we support one another, and it's been great with the city and our local doing so much to help get a voice out there, become united. We've become stronger through this whole COVID process?
Yeah, this is the most that I've seen being a rep, and it's been really, really exciting just to see the small growths in Worcester. It's been really inspiring just to learn the process. So even though everything kind of takes like a long time, but we're in the right direction. So it gives me a lot of hope to see that finally, like people are all like coming out to all the rallies of things, even with like the mask and everything else. That makes me feel really good to know that our union is getting stronger and we're doing what we do. Like that's why we're here. That's the whole point of having this.
Ladies, thank you. It was really great to hear your story. I'm going to bring Carlene back on so we can wrap up. I just want to wrap up by saying we are in a critical moment where we have to continue to hold the Baker administration's feet to the fire to make sure, that we win an efficient, effective, and equitable vaccination program. We already know, despite this wonderful announcement, that educators who are trying to sign up through CVS are getting the same exact problems that the Baker administration has not been able to solve. I heard a story from an educator who got a text message from CVS at 4:25 in the morning saying there's an appointment open. There's large numbers of educators already who are signing up for substitute teachers, and we are lacking substitute teachers. We, the unions, are advocating for a plan that brings maximum efficiency for our school employees and minimum disruption to the student day. So we're fighting for our last mile vaccination program and other programs like it, where we're teaming up with the firefighters and the nurses to set up vaccination sites on our school property. So that's efficient. It overcomes the hurdles to registration, to waiting in line, and we can deal with cycling people through the vaccine so that we don't have large numbers of educators who are going to be out for several days in a row, and so that we can get to herd immunity as quickly as possible. Yes, Melissa Faulkner, let's do this. And that's our job. The fight forward is to fight to make sure we get those educators vaccinated, to make sure that the rollout follows a thoughtful full reopening process, and to make sure that the commissioner leaves the decisions in the hands of the people that know best. And those are the people who reside in the town and go to our schools. So Carlene, I'll turn the last word to you.
Thank you so much, Mary. And before I say a couple of closing things, I just really want to thank Tina and Ashley. Your comments were so real, and they are at Mass Public Health Association. We have been calling on the governor and the Secretary of Health and Human Services, who are making so many of these decisions, to listen to the voice of people most impacted by their decisions. I wish they had been here tonight to hear from the two of you about what their decisions and lack of decisions mean to lives of people, like the lived experience of people, and to the risk that people are facing. So I am just really thank you for your participation tonight. I want to echo also what Melissa said. Yes, we need to continue to work and stand and fight together. The Mass Public Health Association has been working with a group of leaders from the Black community, Latinx community, and immigrant communities for a set of demands for creating additional vaccine equity. If people are interested in that, please visit our website, because again, it's another way to join in this work to demand greater equity in the vaccine rollout and in the state's response to COVID in general. I'm grateful that all of you were here tonight to learn more about the science that we're hearing, to share all of your thoughts in the chat. And we hope to see you at the next month's learning learning forum. So thanks so much for being here, everyone.
Stay well and stay in touch.
Take care. Have a great night.